Thank you for joining us today as we discuss global perspectives and trends on shareholder engagement. The Corporate Secretaries International Association, Deloitte, the Society of Corporate Secretaries U.S., and the New York Stock Exchange. Our two panels today will cover the topics of global shareholder engagement and engaging retail voters. Each panel will run 35 to 40 minutes with time for questions at the end of each. Please type in your questions in the right-hand panel box, and they will be answered at the end of each panel. An email was sent earlier today with attachments for 5 documents related to this discussion. A reminder that this presentation is being recorded and will be available for participants and registrants on Monday, April 20th. I would now like to introduce Paul Kahn, President of ComputerShare's Global Capital Markets Group, who will offer some introductory words for the first panel.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. It's Paul Kahn from ComputerShare. I'd just like to say a few words to introduce the Corporate Secretaries International Association. Firstly, we're delighted to be hosting you for this panel session today. It's going to be very, very informative. Just to say a few words about the CSIA. CSIA was established in 2010 in Geneva. CSIA is an international federation of professional bodies which promote best practices of corporate governance. Recognized by OECD as the global voice of corporate secretaries and governance professionals, CSIA advocates for best practices in corporate governance. In partnership with the IFC, CSIA has developed training materials for corporate secretaries in developing countries around the world. CSIA's membership today includes 18 national representative bodies, including the US and Canada, and represents approximately 100,000 corporate secretaries and governance professionals in more than 80 countries around the world. As the only organization representing the corporate point of view on global governance issues, CSIA is today introducing its shareholder engagement position statement and practices for the corporate secretary, co-sponsored by ComputerShare and Georgeson. So thank you and welcome everyone for joining us. We have almost 500 registrants from all around the world. There's over 200 registrants from Hong Kong and a wide variety of countries. We have 160 people from the US and a wide range of people from Europe, China, Germany, Spain, Botswana, New Zealand, Namibia, Kenya, Mongolia, and Honduras. So this is truly a global event, and I welcome you all to it. So the first session, I'm just going to hand over now to Kathy Coons. Kathy, please.
Thank you, Paul. I'm delighted to be here today. I'm the current president of Corporate Secretaries International Association, or CSIA as we call it, and formerly I was the board chair of the Society of Corporate Governance Professionals and Corporate Secretaries in the United States. And I want to thank you, Paul and Bridget, for hosting this webinar today. CSIA is delighted to partner with ComputerShare in raising awareness of the corporate secretary's important role in shareholder engagement around the world. Our distinguished panel represents a wide range of corporate governance experience. Paul is president of Global Capital Markets for ComputerShare, and Mike Rawson, director of the Global Center of Corporate Governance for Deloitte, will give us an overview of the differences in shareholder engagement practices around the world. And we have 3 former presidents of CSIA with us today. April Chan from Hong Kong, who is the corporate secretary of CLP Holdings, Corinna Wessels, who is the group corporate secretary of Exaro Resources Limited, and Peter Turnbull, who has many years of experience both as a corporate secretary and as a non-executive director, both in Australia and in Hong Kong. So to start off, first, just a few words about our new publication. Shareholder engagement is undeniably an important subject in corporate governance today. Institutional investors are asking companies to provide access to their boards in unprecedented ways. And boards are seeking better ways to explain their corporate governance practices and the positions on significant issues to their investors. We think what has been missing in the debate and the dialogue today is the significant role the corporate secretary plays in this process. CSIA has developed these papers we're introducing today to raise awareness of that role and to share with countries around the world the tools that corporate secretaries have developed to facilitate shareholder engagement. Now we'll turn to our speakers. First, Paul, in your role as Computershare's President of Global Capital Markets, you have a deep understanding of the breadth and depth of these markets and why shareholder engagement practices differ from country to country. Could you help us understand some of those differences in your effect?
Okay, thank you, Kathy. Well, firstly, thank you to CSIA for giving us the opportunity, A, to sponsor the event, and B, to sit at the table as subject matter experts. I think really that one of the first things that an environment like this gives, it gives us a great opportunity to network around, and the CSIA, I believe, is a tremendous networking organization. It's a great organization for sharing best practices. We can all learn from each other. That's the one thing I've learned after spending 35 years in financial markets, that no one has everything right. We all have something to learn from each other, no matter where we are in the world. And ultimately, that knowledge share will lead to standardization of practice, and that can only be a good thing. I would love to say that in 3 minutes I could cover shareholder engagement in all of the countries that are represented here, let alone all of the markets in the world. So I will really just talk to some themes, and then maybe in the second panel we'll dig into some specific issues around shareholder communication and virtual shareholder meetings. But in terms of engagement, when I look at the practices that and principles that CSIA has today issued, we really look at that and say they are the best practices. And then the issue is, how do you then deploy those practices in different markets around the world? I can speak personally to having worked in the UK market, the Australian market, and now the US market for the last 15 years, that when you take these broad practices and you deploy them locally, you end up with slightly different outcomes depending on the regulatory system that we are working with in any particular marketplace, also dependent on the market structure that is in place in that particular market, and also then customs and practices, and also cultural issues as to whether or not people prefer using pieces of paper or to do things in an electronic sense. When we look at engagement, it's very clear that engagement is becoming more of a year-round event between companies and their institutional shareholders. Retail shareholders consume information from lots of different sources now, through the internet, through IR pages. But when we look at engagement, we at Computershare tend to look at the regulated shareholder communications and what companies need to do to communicate with their institutional and retail shareholders. I think you can very clearly segment them into those two categories. When you then look at how is that affected on a market-by-market basis, you really have to look at what does the regulation require and how does the market structure impact the company's ability to communicate with its shareholders. So in the 3 markets in which I've had direct experience, the ones I've spoken about, the UK, Australia, and the US, there are fundamental differences even within those markets, right? So we're talking about very mature markets, very established markets. In these markets, in the US, for example, US corporations must communicate with their registered shareholders and also with their beneficial shareholders. When you go into the UK market and into the Australian market, there is a different market structure, but companies are only required to communicate with their registered shareholders, and investors that are holding beneficially through nominees or custodians may only get free communications indirectly from the custodian as a result of their commercial arrangements with that custodian and nominee. So already you have fundamental differences in terms of how corporations can firstly identify who their shareholders are, how they communicate with those shareholders, direct or indirect shareholders, and ultimately how those shareholders express their opinions and their views, and ultimately how they vote at shareholder meetings. Shareholder communications ultimately comes down to two things. What's the best practice? What does the regulation require? The regulation obviously is the balancing act between right policy at the end of the day, but ultimately it really comes down to who's going to pay for those communications. There's often a debate as to who in fact should bear the cost of communicating corporate announcements and voting materials in the chain of investors. So there's kind of some broader statements and themes. I think the thing that we see very much today is, whilst the national markets are becoming more and more consistent, there are still some fundamental differences. But probably the biggest driver now, I think, is on the one hand standardizing regulation where it's possible, and standardizing process where it's possible, but also cross-border investment is, I think, one of the biggest issues that company secretaries will face in the coming years as they try to identify who holds their securities from overseas and how do they identify who they are and communicate with them. So, I mean, they are some opening remarks. I hope that's helpful to your group. I'd happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Paul. And turning to Mike Rossen of Deloitte. Mike, you're Director of Corporate Governance globally for Deloitte. Can you tell us about how shareholder engagement practices vary in the markets and in the areas that Deloitte is involved in throughout the world?
Absolutely, Kathy, and good morning, afternoon, and good evening to those listening in today, depending on where you are, where we are reaching you, and thanks again for having me here today. I wanted to first start off by saying that shareholder engagement is getting increased attention in the markets across the globe. In Deloitte's latest Director 360 Global Director Survey involving 15 countries, we saw that respondents revealed that 70% see shareholder engagement increasing. So one can take away that institutional investors are becoming more active and want to have more of a say on governance practices. So then one can ask the question, why is shareholder engagement increasing and why now? We are seeing that companies are being looked at more closely, and investors want to have a say in how a company conducts their business. It could also be due to performance concerns or specific events such as M&A activity or the like. Or it could be a crisis at the organization, all of which could trigger a meeting request. Companies are taking note that investors care more about their investment and about corporate governance. So with a global lens, you'll see a host of topics being covered under the shareholder engagement umbrella. These could include, but not limited to, board and committee structure and composition, executive compensation, corporate strategy, transitions within the C-suite, crisis impacting reputation, and of course, what we're all listening today for, shareholder communications, and the list goes on and on. There are a number of practices, and Paul alluded to this just before, that companies can implement to engage with institutional investors. It starts with creating a shareholder engagement policy to cover the practices and procedures that the board and management should follow when interacting with institutional investors. Some of these practices include, at a very high level, being proactive in the communication policy, whether that's sending out hard copy or electronic forms of communications or pushing out press releases. You can also go to the technology aspect, which we'll cover more. Include virtual meetings, webcasts, podcasts, and of course other technology platforms, such as having a robust investor relations website, which allow questions and queries to be channeled to the appropriate member of management or the board. So all in all, practices will vary from country to country and from company to company within a given country, because there's no one-size-fits-all with respect to shareholder engagement. While there are common practices observed across country borders, there are practices that are unique to specific jurisdictions. For example, just want to highlight a few of these country landscapes. I'll start with the U.S. In the U.S., shareholder engagement is seen as being increasing on an increasing trend, but not to the extent of what we see in other areas of the world, more specifically in Europe. Some may even say that large U.S. organizations are being a bit more cautious of increased contact. But there are a number of shareholder engagement policies, such as the one that we're talking about today from the CSIA, that are being sponsored to increase the know-how and leading practices of shareholder engagement. Another example is from CII, the Council of Institutional Investors, which states that directors should respond to communications from shareholders and seek shareholder views on important governance, management, and performance matters. And to accomplish this goal, board shareholder communication policies should be established by companies. And moving on away from the U.S., we take a look at the European Commission. And in the Shareholder Rights Directive, we see that it requires that shareholders disclose how they intend to engage with companies. So this is putting companies on notice about how shareholders will be wanting to engage. Just a few more examples. I want to touch upon the UK. In their stewardship code, which is now a few years old, it was developed to achieve a number of objectives on a comply or explain basis. For example, it calls to build a critical mass of investors that are willing and able to engage with companies in which they invest, to increase the quality and quantity of engagement. Then you take a look at the Dutch code, which calls for the willingness to engage in a dialogue with the company and their fellow shareholders. In the Netherlands, the chair supervises communications with the shareholders. And last but not least, in Sweden and Norway, which I think is a very unique practice, we see that companies in these countries take the 5 largest shareholders and invite them to join the nomination committee to select potential directors. So these are just highlights of a few of the landscapes that we're seeing globally, and we'll be willing to take questions later on, and Kathy, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Mike. That's really interesting. I've very much enjoyed learning about the different perspectives among the CSIA member countries and their experiences in my relationship with CSIA on behalf of the United States. So let's turn to some of our CSIA member past presidents and those who can speak about the practices that they have experienced in their own countries. First, I'd like to have Corinna Wessel, who has been involved in corporate governance in South Africa for many years. And South Africa has been a leader in developing corporate governance standards. Corinna, tell us about that.
Thanks, Kathy, and greetings to all online. As an introduction, I'll just explain a bit about the governance context in South Africa. I'm sure many of our listeners online will be aware of the King Code that's applicable in South Africa, but perhaps for those that are not aware, just a brief history. The first governance best practice guideline or code, or as we commonly refer to it as King 1, was published in South Africa in 1994. And this report was, at that point, internationally recognized by Sir Adrian Cadbury and many others as the best integrated governance code of its type at the time. Then a second updated report was issued in 2002, and the report that we currently use, or the code that we currently use, is the third code, or King 3 as we refer to it, and that was launched in September of 2009. And contrary to the US context and some other countries where governance is legislated, this is a voluntary code containing practices and principles, and it's implemented by companies on a apply or explain basis. Although some aspects of it has been incorporated into the listings requirements, specifically for listed companies, and therefore requires those companies to specifically comply with those practices. It has 9 chapters and deals with quite a variety of governance topics, including ethics, boards and directors and the composition of the boards, including the role of the company secretary, audit committees, the governance of risk, IT governance, compliance with legislation and codes, the role of internal audit, stakeholder engagement, which then touches a bit on engagement with shareholders as well, and the equitable treatment of shareholders, as well as integrated reporting, which is globally becoming an increasingly hot topic. It's been translated into a number of different languages, and it's actually applied by many other countries outside of South Africa as their guiding code with respect to corporate governance as well. And, you know, very exciting stuff is that we're actually working on King 4 at the moment, which we're planning to launch in 2016. Really incorporating the, you know, the changes since 2009 and some new best practices around the world. So after King 3 was launched, in response to a specific request that guidelines for institutional investors be incorporated into King 3, it was actually decided that a bespoke code be developed for institutional investors to specifically touch on this subject. And this recognized that the cause, or at least part of the cause, of many market failures in relation to governance are due to an absence of active institutional investors or investment behavior that's driven by short-term results rather than a longer-term focus. So resultantly, the code which you would have received a copy of, which is called the Code for Responsible Investing in South Africa, or CRISA, was launched in 2011. So while King 3 is written from the board's perspective and what the board and the company should be doing with respect to governance, CRISA is written specifically for the institutional investor, including their service providers and their consultants. And read together with King 3, it provides a holistic framework that relates to the function of all role players in the governance system. CRISA, you would have seen, contains 5 principles and then behaviors or practices that support it. And really at the heart of it is the recognition of the importance of integrating sustainability including, you know, ESG measures or aspects into long-term investment strategies. So it's about the institutional investor really encouraging the companies in which they invest to truly internalize corporate governance best practices and implement the practices contained in King 3. And, you know, you'll recognize that in an environment like South Africa that's centered on a principle-based governance system and not a legislated governance system, the role of the institutional investor and the emphasis that they place on companies and the pressure they place on companies are even more important perhaps in a legislated environment where companies have to implement certain practices. Just very briefly to look at how, you know, CRISA has changed behaviors in South Africa, there's definitely been a significantly, you know, measurable increase in transparency by institutional investors. CRISA also contains recommendations on disclosing your practices and your policies and why you vote in a certain way. So the communication between institutional investors and companies has definitely increased quite a bit. It's made it a lot easier for corporate secretaries to adjust reporting in the integrated report, or even, you know, where possible, adjust resolutions in general meetings to align with the communications and the concerns that have been received from institutional investors. So it's made the engagement a lot more practical, a lot more proactive, and a lot more honest in terms of really, you know, fulfilling the core of what the institutional investor would like to see.
Thank you so much, Karina. Very much appreciate that overview, and I think certainly those in the United States look forward to reading about the principles that you have established for institutional investors. I'd like to turn now to Peter Turnbull, who is from Australia. Has been corporate secretary and an attorney practicing corporate governance work and corporate law, as well as serves on many boards of individual companies in Australia. So he brings to us the perspective of not only corporate governance professional, but also a director, and has had some recent experiences with shareholder activism in the board. Welcome, Peter, and look forward to hearing your experiences.
Thank you very much, Kathy, and hi to all online, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. I very much appreciate it. If I could just start, I think, with a brief description of the governance overlay in Australia. We have a very, very complex Corporations Act, Companies Act it's actually called. which is probably over 1,000 pages. That really regulates the strict legal concepts. What really regulates governance in Australia, and I'm focusing this morning, I guess, really on the listed public company environment, is the Australian Stock Exchange Corporate Governance Principles and Guidelines, which have been in place since about 2003. We're on about our 3rd edition of that. Like some of the other jurisdictions, this is a principles-based system, which means it's an if not, why not regime, as we call it in Australia. In other words, principles and benchmarks and standards are set out in quite some detail, and it's not to say you have to follow them, but if you don't, you have to explain, and therefore you live and die in a sense on the logic and acceptance of why you're not doing something. And this covers all sorts of things, composition of board, it covers everything, but I guess the focus this morning is really about shareholder engagement, and Principle 6 is the relevant one in the ASX guidelines, and there's 3 subcategories there, and these principles talk about and really mandate companies taking a certain view on life and certain action. That is, clearly explaining to shareholders how they're going to engage with them, having very detailed and discrete parts of their websites where policies and procedures and ethics and views on life are up there for all to see. You are required to publish in some detail what the investor relations program is, how you go about communicating and dealing with people, and all the policies and procedures also have to be up on the website as well. So there's a fair bit of publication of really all the core elements of how you're going to engage with shareholders, so everybody knows what to expect. Fundamentally for me, I mean, most things in business are about communication for me at the end of the day, whether it's brand, image, marketing, advertising, getting your strategies across. So shareholder engagement is a really important part of that for any company, I think. And it's core business for directors. It's absolutely core business for directors. Not everyone in Australia understands that, but certainly I think most do now, and there's a very much a growing acceptance that directors need to be very aware of and very involved in this. And it's not just to leave it to the investor relations manager or the management team, the executive team situation. If you're not involved, it's going to be at your peril into the future. I like to work on a pretty simple communication adage, that's communicate early, often, and fully. And I don't think you'll go too far wrong with that. If I could just touch on the sort of process in Australia, not all, but many companies have a due year end to equate to the tax year. So we have 2 rounds. What's really grown up in Australia is 2 rounds of engagement with institutional investors and proxy advisors. We have all the big proxy advisors now in Australia. We have a number of very large listed legal firms. We have litigation funders, and there's an underlay there of people looking for targets all the time. So that's kind of a subset of your whole engagement process and why you need to be doing it pretty well. But twice a year, and I've only just done it in the last couple of weeks, we have a round of investor engagement, proxy advisor engagement about March, April, and then in the lead up to the end of the AGM season, which most people have AGMs September, October. This is for June year end people. And this is a great opportunity to get your messages across. A lot of the proxy advisors are maybe not as well resourced as they could be in Australia, so the attention spans are very short. Some of them won't meet with you unless there's an issue. Most will meet with the companies I'm involved with, but it's just a great opportunity to get your messages across in terms of what you've done on the governance front, what's advanced in terms of the company's strategy, and listening to skill. You listen to them and you get the feedback. What, if anything, is concerning them. And I think what's changed over recent years is the team that goes to these meetings. I would say in Australia a few years ago it was pretty much an executive situation. For instance, what I did a couple of weeks ago as the chair of the company, myself as the chair of what we call the Remuneration Committee. I also chair a Risk and Governance Committee, so it's the chair of the company, myself, the Investor Relations Manager, the Managing Director, and a couple of the executives. So it's a pretty senior team and comprehensive team that does the rounds, and I think it should be, because you've got a quick and pretty limited chance to get your messages across and to listen to the feedback. Shareholder activism is really a growing issue in Australia, and I think, if I could say, I think getting a pretty fair lead from this country in terms of how it's done and why it's done and how it's resourced and all that kind of thing, but it is very much a growing issue. And the sensible directors, and I think that's most of them now, are very aware of this, and there's much more risk management and planning around the fact that really everybody is going to be dealing with a shareholder activism issue, as one of my companies did last year. And it's not a lot of fun in many senses. It wasn't that we weren't prepared. Often in Australia, governance issues are being used as a hook to get to other situations. So the governance might actually be not too bad, but governance in the lead up to the AGM gets publicity. You know, allegations of bad governance or governance that doesn't meet appropriate benchmarks, but often the prize or the goal is actually something different. But the board will still have to deal with the publicity and angst that comes with all of this. It happens very quickly, as many around the table would know. It's a bit of a whirlwind. It can get quite emotional. Defamatory statements can be thrown around, and it can get quite nasty. So I think the message there is be ready for it, realise that it's part of life, plan for it, risk manage it. And I think most sensible directors in Australia are much more aware of it. What most companies don't want to live with is the publicity that comes with it, because it can be very, very damaging. I think there's another quick issue which I think the smarter boards, and I'm certainly pushing this message, and this goes to the composition of boards, I guess, need one or two people that can actually think like activists on the board. You know, it's a check on strategy. It's a test of this strategy to say, well, we want to go this way. Why not? What would an activist do? Are we missing anything? Are there any gaps there? Have we not risk managed this properly? So I can see that in future being a bit of a check on new strategic directions. It may sound like a strange one, but I think it is a bit of a logical process to apply to things. Just finally, proxy advisors. We've got all the people that really exist, you know, the CGIs and the ISSs. They're all in Australia now, and they've really become part of life. And as I said, we do the 2 rounds. It's a pretty short attention span sometimes. You've really got to have your messages honed down. You've got to have your meeting schedule set up well in advance, and be pretty proactive and pretty pithy and pretty clear about what your messages are, particularly what governance developments are taking place, where your strategy is going, and are there any concerns to that?
Thank you, Peter. Great perspective from the directors and the input to the panel and the audience. Now I'd like to turn to April Chan. April's name is almost synonymous with corporate governance in Hong Kong and China. And Hong Kong has been a leader in corporate governance around the world. April, could you tell us what Hong Kong is doing to encourage shareholder engagement, and especially in companies that are family-owned, non-public companies, or that are owned by the state?
Thank you very much, Kathy, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all those online wherever you are. Actually, in the context of Asian companies, most of them are either family-controlled or state-owned. For example, among the 50 Hang Seng Index constituent companies in Hong Kong, more than 80% of them fall into this category. So one may naturally think that engagement of shareholders is just a matter for the European and US companies only, because people may be thinking that there won't be an issue at all in general for Asian companies to get the resolutions passed at general meetings with the support of their dominant shareholders. Of course, save for the case where only disinterested shareholders are allowed to vote. So these, I would say, are the good old days in fact. Now, in recent years, regulators in the Asian market have introduced requirements for companies to engage shareholders. For example, the Hong Kong Stock Exchange Corporate Governance Code has put a dedicated section on communication with shareholders. It lays down the principle that the board should be responsible for maintaining an ongoing dialogue with shareholders, and in particular, use annual general meetings or other general meetings to communicate with them and engage their participation. The board should also establish a shareholders communication policy and review it on a regular basis to ensure its effectiveness. On the voting by poll, the Stock Exchange Code lays down the principle that the issuer should ensure that shareholders are familiar with the detailed procedures for conducting a poll. In respect of shareholders' rights, issuers should publish procedures to explain how shareholders can convene general meetings, and it also needs to publish procedures by which inquiries may be put to the board and sufficient contact details to enable these inquiries to be properly directed. So, another driver, I would say, for robust engagement with shareholders is competition for global capital. Let me share with you some statistics published by the Hong Kong Exchange and Clearing Company Limited. At the end of 2014, there were 640 debt securities, mainly RMB bonds, RMB, listed on the main board, compared to only 403, equivalent to 79 RMB bonds at the end of 2013. The total turnover of debt securities in 2014 was about Hong Kong dollar 6 billion, up 36% from 4 billion in 2013. A total of 281 debt securities were newly listed during the year, compared to 170 in 2013, raising new funds of approximately close to 1,000 billion Hong Kong dollars, equivalent to 67% more than those in 2013. So we can see that companies are more aware of the need and the importance to engage with institutional investors with a view to impressing them on the performance of the company, and also understanding, like what Peter said, the expectations they may have on the company. In case of CLP, I'd like to share a little bit of experience in terms of shareholders' engagement. We have attached great importance in both institutional and retail shareholders' engagement. As you all know, as an electricity generation supply company, it's important to maintain the license to operate from the community, including our retail shareholders. And not just in CLP, actually, in general, for most big listed companies in Hong Kong, most of the retail shareholders are Hong Kong-based. And they have been holding the company shares for many years. So their support is crucial in the discussions of critical issues. Say in that CLP case, could be the regulatory regime of the Hong Kong electricity market. And we have several means to communicate and engage our shareholders. For example, through general meetings, through disclosures in our annual report, timely announcements, through publication of information on the website, through investor meetings, through ESG briefings, and participation in like the talk today. And we appreciate and treasure feedback from shareholders, and that is very important to learn about their expectations and improve their engagement with them. And I think I will cover a little bit more details in the second panel about the creative practices in CLP. So all in all, I believe there is a trend to convert shareholder engagement practices in Asia with the rest of the world.
Thank you, April. Appreciate that. Just one quick run around our panel members. Since it's a global panel, we have a global audience. I'd like us to each go around and offer what you think we can learn from each other in this practice, a perspective from you and from your country, just very briefly. How do you think we can learn from each other? Michael, why don't you start?
Sure, no problem, Kathy. I think after hearing from Paul, Karina, Peter, and April, we can all agree that there are various leading practices that companies around the globe can incorporate. But maybe something to consider, no matter where you're situated in the world. Take a look at countries that have introduced regulation or their own codes focusing on shareholder engagements, and thinking about how you can incorporate some of these practices with respect to your own shareholder engagement policy. It may not be a requirement for you, but these are certainly practices that you can incorporate.
Thank you, Michael. Karina.
Thanks, Kathy. I think, from my perspective, the most important thing, if we relate it back to the role of the corporate secretary, is that you need a corporate secretary that truly understands the business in which it operates. And only then can you really take into consideration the legitimate interests and expectations of not just your shareholders, but your broader stakeholder base, and incorporate that into the bigger decision-making of the business. But you need a front-footed corporate secretary that's proactive and that engages well with stakeholders in general to truly understand what's important for them and take that back to the business and to the board of directors and the company as a whole.
Thank you. Peter.
Thanks, Kathy. I think what we're talking about this morning is communication. I think this sort of platform that CSIA creates for us all to be sharing experiences around the world is absolutely fundamentally important and beneficial. So, keeping on doing what we're doing here, I think, is really important. Continuous reform of governance principles and standards, I think, is important. I think Karina gave us an overview of what's happening in South Africa on that front. Moving beyond just institutional shareholders to involve retail shareholders a bit better in the communication process. I think April touched on. I think that's to be commended too. And I guess the sort of discussions we have here hopefully lead us to the highest common denominator of standards and principles, not the lowest common denominator. And I think that's another benefit of what we do. But keeping on doing what we're doing in terms of learning and talking about what's happening in different parts of the world, and hopefully helping to lift standards overall, I think is one of the things we learn from each other.
Thank you. And April.
Just a simple statement. I think recognizing every company is different and their culture is different. It's important to look around the international best practices with a view to find the right ones which you can easily adapt and appropriate for your own company in terms of the shareholder engagement.
Well, thank you. And before turning it over to Paul, I'd like to thank the members of the panel for your insight and for your perspective on this important topic, and all those who have helped to support us in developing and publicizing our new shareholder engagement practical steps for corporate secretaries. And Paul, turning to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Kathy. I'll move into the second panel session, which is engaging retail shareholders. I'm delighted to be joined by April Chan, Cy Francis from the New York Stock Exchange, Teresa Malloy from Prudential, by telephone, Chris Haven from Georgeson, and Darla Duffy from the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals. So this is a really interesting session, and I will try to always remind myself that I'm a moderator and SME. So if I straight off point someone, so there's really two key things here. We really want to focus on how companies can use electronic communication to reach their shareholders, in particular their retail shareholders, and secondly, the use of electronic technology on shareholder forums, but in particular the shareholder meeting. So starting on the first topic of electronic communication with retail shareholders, I'd like to kick off by asking Darla Stuckey to lead us through and give us some background to what's been happening in the U.S. environment to help companies almost reduce their costs, but try and engage retail shareholders more effectively into the process.
Thank you, Paul, and I thank you for having me here, and thanks, Kathy, for inviting me. And I think all of you are having fun and being awake and interested in what's very tedious but important to all of us here. What's happening in the electronic communication space is obviously this, in terms of retail voting, is sort of the same, I think, in the world. People are using electronic communication more and more and more. In January of 2008, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission allowed companies to no longer mail full sets of proxy materials in order to solicit shareholders' votes. This is what we call notice and access. Companies are now allowed to send a one-page notice saying your proxy materials are available online. Please go here and read them and vote. They did not allow a proxy card, an actual voting card, to be sent with that. So a retail holder who had to go online or send a form back by mail to get the full package and to get the actual proxy card to vote. So it's been 7 years. Why companies have used the notice and access procedure. They do save quite a bit of money in terms of printing and postage. The trend of use has been increasing every year, not exponentially, but it has been slowly increasing. The latest stats I saw last year, there's about 36% adoption of some form of notice and access by issuers. This represents about 76% of street name positions. So what's happened? Companies have found that as they send more notice and access packages, they get a smaller vote return. They do save costs, but they get a smaller vote return. So this is problematic for some companies who don't want high shareholder vote returns. So what they've been able to do is to determine, based on voting patterns, which shareholders will vote with the notice and access package and which won't. And so they sort of stratify their shareholder base and use notice and access package where they only think they can get the most bang for their buck. The other thing that's going on is something called e-delivery or e-proxy, which is actually sending proxy materials directly to an email address. In the U.S., companies don't have email addresses of all of their retail holders because they're held through brokerage accounts and street name. But certainly there is a large group of shareholders which companies do have email addresses for, and that would be their own employees. So employees get their packages that way. And some retail holders have opted in to the system where they can get materials electronically. And the findings on e-delivery is that the vote yield is higher with e-delivery than it is with notice and access. Now, full paper packages in the U.S. still remains the highest yield. So if you are a company that needs every vote, if you're in a contest, or if you have a contentious matter on your ballot, I suspect that you're going to spend more money and you're going to send more paper full packages. I'm mindful of the time, so I'm going to just sort of stop there, and I hope other people will jump in.
Maybe at that point, Chris, if I can introduce you and ask you to comment on these developments of Georgeson, please.
Sure. So by very brief introduction, Georgeson is a proxy solicitation firm that helps public entities communicate with their stakeholders. So to build on what Darla said, an important part of what a public company should do in advance of any shareholder meeting is to carefully analyze their shareholder base so that they can plan ahead and figure out who their shareholders are. Certainly one of the challenges in the U.S. is that shareholders are essentially able to hide their identities. And so in the U.S., this is called an objecting beneficial owner. And essentially the shareholder does not have to tell the issuer who they are. They can hide behind the bank or broker custodians in the U.S. So engagement is kind of a funny term when you don't know who it is you're engaging with. And that's often the case in the United States. You certainly or typically will know who your major institutional investors are through public filings, albeit very late and delayed public filings. But when it comes down to the actual individual holders, it's a very major challenge for certainly U.S. companies to communicate with their shareholders. And unfortunately, companies are starting to take advantage of technology, which I think we'll talk about in a few minutes, and utilizing some very creative ways to communicate with those stakeholders.
Thank you. We might use that point. Teresa, do we have you on the telephone? Teresa Malloy from Prudential. Maybe if you could give us some insight as to some of the practices that you have deployed at Prudential to engage your retail shareholders.
Certainly. Well, good morning, and thanks very much for inviting Prudential to participate on this very, very important topic regarding retail shareholder engagement. First of all, I'm calling from I'm not at the desk with the rest of my colleagues on the call, so I apologize if you can't hear what I'm saying. So if you can't, just give me the signal, and I'll be happy to speak louder. At Prudential, our situation is a little bit unique. We went public in December 2001 when we converted from a mutual company which was owned by our policyholders into a publicly traded company. And the result was that our policyholders could either take cash or stock, and many of them decided that they wanted to take Prudential stock. So the result was that Prudential now had to manage relationships with a whole group of new registered shareholders. And as many of you know, by the mid to latter part of the last decade, there were a few trends that were emerging as it relates to communicating with shareholders. There are advances in technology, which prompted the SEC to create Notice and Access, which Darla went over earlier. Also, investors were starting to embrace the Internet and use it as a resource for information. And then, of course, Dodd-Frank gave investors more influence to vote for CEO compensation. So as all this was happening, Prudential was also thinking ahead and trying to figure out how we could best accommodate the needs of our registered shareholders from a communications as well as a technology perspective. So we did a couple of things. Several times a year, we send our registered shareholders a communication which encourages them to enroll to receive the proxy material, their account statements, as well as their tax material online. In addition, in the same communication, we also encourage our investors who do not have direct deposits for their dividends, and just to familiarize you with with the demographics of our registered shareholders, they are by and large senior citizens that rely not solely on the dividend, but they definitely look forward to their dividend from Prudential. So what we encourage them to do is we encourage them to take direct deposit, and we appeal to them both from a socially responsible vantage that it's quicker, it saves gas, it gives you an opportunity to spend some of your retirement years at leisure as opposed to taking a check and driving to the bank. In addition, in the same, we also have a on our proxy cards, which I'm going to talk about in the next part of our series here. We encourage our registered shareholders to send us comments, and in the comment boxes, frequently what our investors tell us is that they have either questions about online voting, or they have suggestions about how to make online voting easier for them. And again, remember that these are by and large senior citizens, so some of them are not very savvy as it relates to technology. So what we try to do is try to work with ComputerShare and share these observations with ComputerShare in the hopes that we can enhance the site in order to make it user-friendly. And if necessary, we can also reach out to the registered shareholder and help them navigate through the site. So back to you.
Okay, well, thank you for that, Teresa. If I could hand over to Ty, and Ty, maybe you could give us the perspective of communications between issuers and investors from an exchange perspective and some of the things you're seeing in the marketplace.
Well, thank you. I want to
coined David Frost by, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome. I think technology has transformed the way issuers are communicating with shareholders. I think it's no longer whether a company decides to publish its annual statements, its 10K or proxy statements digitally, in what format. It's the real-time dialogue that companies are now having with their stockholders. Need for transparency and for stakeholders to have some real-time information at their fingertips has really pushed both the SEC, the issuer community, and exchanges into the 21st century. Obviously, this can provide numerous hurdles to navigate, which the IRO, corporate secretary, and communications teams should not be one of those hurdles, as it's crucial that any communications that directors or issuers are having with shareholders have direct communication with the corporate secretary or the IRO. Having a policy, including all these new technologies, having a mandate for interaction or having any messaging aligning with management is really crucial. And I think as far as the exchanges are concerned, we encourage companies to communicate as much as they can with shareholders using any form deemed appropriate, but being very careful to align themselves with Regulation FD. I think we can all thank Reed Hastings for pushing both the SEC and us into the 21st century for that a few years ago. I think the bigger picture we need to look at is not so much how issuers are communicating with shareholders, but how shareholders are communicating with issuers. I refer to the shareholder activists, because we're not playing on an even playing field, and I think it's crucial that issuers, and whether they're directors or IROs, are very mindful of how they're communicating back. And Carl Icahn has a very open field to play with, and he can use any one of the social technologies at his behest, whereas institutional investors have got to be a little bit more careful on how they're communicating. We need to look at what Regulation FD states. We need to be careful that whatever communications we're sending back are aligning with our management. We're going to talk a little bit more about virtual shareholder meetings and the pros and cons of those. We can talk about the issues that Symantec had in 2010, moving forward to HP's virtual online only meeting they had last month. I think the main thing we need to look at is that this is happening all over the world now, and as people are using SlideShare and Twitter and YouTube to communicate their messages, we've got to be very careful that this real-time information is getting across to people, is used productively. And I can give you one example of how these messages are being construed as material. Or a CFO is at a football game, and for everyone around the world, I'm talking about American football. A CFO's at a Jets game, and after the third quarter, having a terrible, terrible time, he tweets out inadvertently, "That was the worst third quarter I've ever seen." Now, on the part of the CFO, he has context. He's sitting on the game with his family, saying that Jets game was pretty bad. But as far as the issuer community at large saw, a CFO of a public traded company is telling them that was the worst third quarter they've ever had. And stocks take a dip. SEC gets involved, and they get investigated to whether they counteracted Regulation FD. 4 characters would have saved that CFO with the hashtag JATS, Jets. So I think we need to look at how we're communicating and in what formats.
So Ty, I think that is a great anecdote. I think that wise counsel to this group of us here in the room and to everyone listening. I think listening to the panel, it strikes me as really we're at this crossroads where regulators are looking to change the regulatory framework to cause issuers to communicate more effectively with their shareholders. Shareholders are certainly looking to engage with issuers, but there is really a technological shift going on, and more people are using social media to communicate amongst themselves. So whether companies like this or not, they're being dragged into this environment. I think that's going to strain the regulatory framework as we move forward, and it's a fine balancing act between looking at what you must do from a regulatory perspective and what you need to do to protect your brand and keep the market informed. We are, I think, the two questions from our audience. Okay, well, we might at this moment then just switch straight over Ty, you mentioned just recently that Hewlett-Packard HP ran their shareholder meeting on a fully electronic basis, we'll call a virtual shareholder meeting. I'd really like to canvass the panel to get a feel for how virtual shareholder meetings are operating currently, what the trends are. Clearly the technology is there. I think this is a case where the technology is there to operate these meetings, but it's interesting to see where corporates are and maybe Darla, if I could hand to you, if you could give us some perspective from your experience, what are corporates thinking about virtual shareholder meetings?
Okay, thanks, Paul. Just for the people that are not U.S.-based, U.S. shareholder meetings, or what Europeans and others call AGMs, many times in the past have been very ho-hum, not well-attended events. Sometimes they're held in a conference room just with the board and a few employees. However, I know that's not the case in all countries, and there has been in recent history a trend of more shareholders attending and expressing their views in person. So you have to keep that backdrop, because when virtual shareholder meetings first came about, if you were a company that does nothing but have directors in a boardroom, you're thinking, well, maybe I should have a virtual meeting because maybe then my shareholders could actually attend and see what we're doing because they don't travel or whatever. So that's kind of, I think, where it started. Companies, the virtual technology is there. It is not cheap. Sometimes it's actually cheaper to have a meeting of your board in your conference room. If you are a company that has a lot of retirees, a lot of employees, you will have a more expensive meeting if you host it and you invite everyone and they show up, and it can be a very long. That's a more expensive proposition. But companies do look at virtual meetings for a couple of reasons: to try to save costs, although the technology has some costs attended to it, and whether they want to try to allow more shareholders to attend virtually. Now, counterweight that with some investors who believe that companies that have virtual meetings are trying to somehow freeze out people from attending in person, and they want to actually be in the room and look at the directors and so there is some view that companies might do virtual-only meetings so they don't have to, quote-unquote, face their shareholders. And a few years ago, a group of industry participants got together and put together these guidelines for, that's why it's called Protecting and Enhancing Online Shareholder Meetings. The idea was that you had to protect shareholders to let them have the same access to via a virtual meeting as they would if they were in person. And this document is a good document if you're interested. It's a few years old, but it has good background, and it has some of the concerns, as you can see, that shareholders had, and came out with some guidelines about what companies should think about. If a company has nothing of other than director elections, ratification of auditors, say on their ballot, maybe they'll choose to have a virtual meeting because they don't have anyone doing a shareholder proposal. That's one situation where you might want to do it. However, there are now ways that through the virtual meeting that shareholders can actually attend virtually on a screen, read your proposal, and can actually interact. I'll stop there.
Excellent. No, that's good. I think it's very clear that the technology companies are starting to use that, and I'm sure this is the start of a growing trend. April, maybe I could ask you to give us the perspective of a corporate secretary and companies generally in Hong Kong, perhaps where the regulators are with virtual meetings.
Okay. Thank you, Paul. Actually, Hong Kong is still in a physical general meeting era, I would say. There are a lot of challenges in order for Hong Kong, say, to follow the U.S. steps. I guess the challenge is that Hong Kong is a small place. And also due to the geography, shareholders will find it not so difficult to come to attend a physical general meeting. And also the culture in Hong Kong companies, say for example in CLP's case, I think the biggest attraction of our general meeting is our chairman. our shareholders come to our general meeting with their camera, their smartphone, and the first thing they do is to line up to take a photograph of our chair. To virtual meeting, I think they will be a little bit disappointed. So they take it like themselves as a homecoming event for our shareholders. Having said that, I think probably this is a trend that may be impacting to the rest of the world as. But holding general meeting in a virtual form needs the support of statutory requirements. And the company's ordinance in Hong Kong has got a major revamp last year. Starting from 3rd of March 2014, there is a provision, actually it's a starting point, is that a company may hold a general meeting at 2 or more places using any technology that enables members of the company who are not together at the same place to listen, speak, and vote at the meeting, subject to any provision of the company's articles. At least it's a starting point, but still you need to have a physical meeting in one place. Another challenge is the proxy. In order to enable a virtual meeting to take place, you've got to allow sending electronic proxy and receiving electronic proxy. And in the new company's ordinance, it also enable that if a company has given an electronic address in an instrument of proxy or an invitation to appoint a proxy issued by the company in relation to the meeting, it is to be regarded as having agreed that any document or information relating to proxies for that meeting may be sent by electronic means to that address, again, subject to any conditions or limitations specified in the instrument or invitation. Unfortunately, it's really new. Only a few companies in Hong Kong using these electronic proxy, and the response rate from the shareholders is extremely low. And another thing about the proxies is that the new company's ordinance also enable a member of company to appoint separate proxies to represent respectively the number of shares held by the member that is specified in their instruments of appointment. So I guess maybe virtual meeting may help when shareholders want to send 20 proxies to attend general meeting where food and drinks is served. That may help the company. So I think this is a trend moving, and the regulators are possibly aware of this, and they try to introduce some legislation to enable it, but still subject to a lot of considerations.
Great, that's good. Ty, maybe I could just on that point, I mean, what's the view of the NYSE about the adoption of these technologies around formal shareholder meetings?
I'll try and make this brief after following what people think is the most knowledgeable corporate secretary in Asia, April. I feel like I'm the support band. So you know, as an exchange, we're constantly looking to raise the governance bar, and you know, by our NYSE Governance Services division, we try and educate issuers to look at best practices and help benchmark their policies and procedures. As far as virtual meetings are concerned, I mean, I can mention 3, including HP, Sprint, and MasterStewart on the media. Coincidentally, and this is a coincidence, all NYSE listed companies have looked to use a virtual online only meeting. There are a lot of pros and cons of using this kind of format, the same way people view earnings calls. If you're an analyst who is annoyed management, the chances are you may not likely have a say at the table. Virtual online meetings do have that issue as well. I think Darla's white paper she wrote with Broadridge is a very, very good kind of overview on the pros and cons of using virtual meetings. They're all, you know, Nell Minow has been very vocal in saying that, you know, the annual meeting is where you look the chairman or the CEO in the eye, shake his hand and say, this is the problem I've got. The downsides of having such a virtual meeting is much like webinars are that, you know, when questions are asked, follow-up questions can also fall by the wayside, and sometimes not follow up as such. I think that companies need to be very transparent what they're doing. We obviously, as an exchange, we advocate transparency and you know, good governance. We hope that companies follow that and don't use virtual meetings to sidestep potential issues that shareholders have.
Yeah, that's good. I think we're very much at the stage of this being a technology that readily exists, but it's an emerging usage of these technologies in the corporate environment. And I think some companies will experiment with this technology to extend the reach of the physical shareholder meeting to allow other people to participate remotely. Some will do remote-only, fully virtual meetings, and I think other companies will adopt a wait-and-see approach, as may other countries. So this is clearly a trend that I think we should monitor and share best practice on around the world. I think 5 years down the track will be great.
Paul, can I say one thing? Because I can't
Sorry,
resist
Paula.
this. No, I just want to say on virtual, I wanted to follow that. So yesterday, I thought, oh my God, I haven't prepared for this webcast yet, and I've got to talk about new cool things. So this morning I put in my cell phone, I am a Coke shareholder. And when you Google, I am a Coke shareholder, you get pulled up to the Coca-Cola website, investor relations. The first thing you see is the proxy. They're having a virtual annual meeting. There's all kinds of little links. If you'd like to post a question, put it here, submit this form. If you'd like to send us a video clip of your question, please send it here. I don't know what that means. Perhaps that means you're going to play your video clip at the annual meeting. But I thought it was fascinating. And you keep scrolling down, and as Ty mentioned social media earlier, there are like 7 social media sites with all of the followers that Coca-Cola has. Some of them I don't even recognize, although I think it's Instagram and who knows. Anyway, it's quite fascinating. So, and I mentioned, I knew it wouldn't be the case for Coke because they are a very consumer-focused company, and they are interested in what their customers have to say about them as well as their shareholders, all stakeholders. And I did actually click on the form to submit the form for a question, and I did notice you do have to have a control number. So there is some control over, I mean, they're having a hybrid meeting, so there's also instructions on how to attend in person. So each company decides who they let in, if they let in any people other than shareholders, and I'm not sure what Coke does about that. But at least for the annual meeting purposes, you do have to prove that you're a shareholder. But I'm sure they have a lot. So it's quite fascinating.
I think Dara makes a very good point. I think when we're talking about the international environment, a lot of countries have specific policies. With the U.S., we're beholden to our state's regulations, where if you're a Delaware registered corporation, you are allowed a virtual only meeting. In New York and New Jersey, you're not. So it really goes back to how people are looking at what regulations they have. And as far as it being a widespread phenomenon, in 2013, I think Broadridge registered 35 virtual only shareholder meetings, and last year only 53. So it's certainly not a landslide or an avalanche of virtual shareholder meetings, but as Dara said, we are moving closer to what I think is the best value of the hybrid meeting, and certainly putting your question as a video clip, I think is a great way forward.
Look, I think it's interesting. Eric Jackson, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, went online with a campaign on YouTube against Yahoo. I mean, that was such cutting edge. He obviously had a very, very significant position in the company and used that as a way to communicate.
Eric Jackson doesn't like Yahoo? That's shocking.
No, I didn't say he didn't like Yahoo. He had a plan B to shake up Yahoo at that particular time. So I think, the use of YouTube by investors is clearly something that will happen going forward. I mean, while we're on the topic of creative practices by issuers, maybe, Teresa, we can bring you in, if you're still on the phone, about some of the things you've done at Prudential to engage your shareholders in this way.
Sure, I'd love to. Well, over the last couple of years, Prudential's been extremely creative in our communication strategy to our registered shareholders. And we do this in a number of ways. We absolutely want to encourage our registered shareholders to vote the proxy because, as many of us are aware, registered shareholders are typically favorable to management as it relates to the vote. So how do we do this? We do this in a couple of ways. For voting, what we do is we appeal to our registered shareholders, their socially responsible side, by offering them either an eco-friendly tote bag or a tree planted in their name if they vote. No matter how they vote, as long as they vote, we give them one of these two tokens of our appreciation. And we accomplish this, obviously, by using the proxy card, and the shareholder will know whether they want the bag or whether they want the tree. So what are the results of this campaign? Well, since we started the program in 2010, we've planted over 550,000 trees via American Forest, and we've also given out 400,000 tote bags. And I can tell you that right now, I mentioned earlier that our registered shareholders send us notes on our proxy cards, and I can't tell you how many really sweet notes we get back from our registered shareholders about how they appreciate the efforts. We have, over the last, since we started this outreach campaign in 2010, we've received over 12,000 comments on our proxy cards. So it definitely is a phenomenal way for us to cultivate our relationship with our registered shareholders and really make them feel they're part of the Prudential family. Also, our board is extremely interested in hearing what these registered shareholders have to say and what their opinions are. Every year, prior to our annual meeting, we do a report for the board, and we explain to them how many responses we've received and the nature and the tone of the responses that we've received from our registered shareholders. When we can, we try to respond to as many comments as possible, especially to those shareholders that have very specific requests or suggestions. And we really do believe that this is a very creative way to engage with these loyal investors, many of whom have been with us since they were originally customers because they were part of the conversion to when we became a publicly traded company. So they were customers, and they're very, very loyal shareholders because most of them have been with us for nearly 15 years.
April, maybe we
Yes.
can go back to Hong Kong and tell us what creative practices you're employing to look after thousands of people that you engage with at your meeting.
Thank you, Paul. Actually, in addition to the usual shareholder hotline and dedicated email address, we have organized 2 signature events every year for our shareholders. One is our shareholders visit, which lasts from normally from November to end of April. We normally have our AGM in May. So through this almost 6 months, we call it a season, that we invite our shareholders to visit our facilities, meet with our directors and senior management during lunch. So over the past 12 years, we have been doing this for 12 years, and every year we always include one new element of visit. They may go to the power station a few times already, but we always have new elements. So a lot of our shareholders are repetitive visitors, but they still enjoy the visit. The good thing about the visit is that it creates a face-to-face communication with our directors and senior management. And for every visit, we have invited one director or one senior management to host a lunch with the shareholders, and they just love it. They just come with a lot of questions, and the questions, of course, range from when will we issue bonus shares to why you still continue to invest in Australia, say, for example. So we found that those shareholders are quite well informed, although most of them are retirees. And we even organize weekend visits to facilitate those working so shareholders are still in employment so that they can come as well. And during this visit, we organize a workshop for every visit, which will include our key messages that we would like to convey to our shareholders around that period of time, and they need to fill in a feedback form after the visit. There's no free lunch because, and so the feedback form, we make use of it to include a number of questions which could be covering some topical issues that we want to seek shareholders' views. For example, what do you think about the board? Whether you think that they are diverse enough, etc. Okay, and then another signature event is our annual general meeting. As I said, they feel like it's a homecoming event, and CLP, I think, has the biggest attendance in terms of Hong Kong listed companies. We have over 1,000 shareholders attending our AGM. as opposed to a lot of Hong Kong companies, they may just have around 50 shareholders. So we make use of these events as a communication with our shareholders. We organize exhibitions at the AGM venue, displaying what are the current issues, what is CLP's position, highlighting the performance over the year and the outlook for the future. And we have set up a shareholders corner where we assign CLP ambassadors to answer questions direct from our shareholders. And of course, we made some special corporate souvenirs for our shareholders every year that encourage them to come back again.
Well, this is a fascinating intersection because clearly I think the practices that are emerging in the US and the practices that are, I think, deeply entrenched in Hong Kong are at different phases of their evolution. I think one of the things that is absolutely critical is, April, you said, the size of the Hong Kong geography means that people are mobile, they can get to meetings. Clearly, in the US, shareholders can't get to all of the meetings just because of the physical distance. I think when we start to look at how we engage with international shareholders who invest in our companies, these newer technologies are ways in which we can actually embrace international shareholders. So I think it's going to be a fascinating time. Clearly, this is an area where I think over the next 5 years we'll see significant change, and clearly the technologies will be dragging the regulations into the modern era. Can we see if we have any questions from the audience, please? This is where. Okay, so Teresa, are you still on the phone? Teresa Malloy.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, there's a very specific question for you, and maybe you can take this, if not a follow-up. The question is, what is the actual wording or verbiage Prudential uses on their proxy cards? Comments.
I'm sorry, what was the question?
What is the wording that you use on your proxy cards to solicit comment?
Unfortunately, I don't have a card with me, but it is, and if the individual, if you can identify them after the call, I'm happy to send them a copy. But it is simply a box that has a that has a notation that please send us your comments.
Great. Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. And there's one other question. Other than sending communications regarding proxy materials, what types of communications do companies usually have with their shareholders, particularly their large shareholders? What points should be covered in communications policy? Maybe Peter, could we ask you to address that one?
Sorry.
Sorry.
I got half of it.
Let me read it again. Other than sending communications regarding proxy or other forms of communication, what types of communications do companies usually have with their shareholders, particularly their large shareholders? What points should be covered by communications policy?
What a number of companies are starting to do, and some have done it for some time, is shareholder information days, which can include retail and institutional types. So wants quite an open kind of a venue. I think we're going to see more and more of that in Australia. In terms of the points to be covered, I mean, shareholders will really expect the board and the management team who are there to do some sort of presentation, I guess, to kick things off. And it becomes a presentation moving into a question and answer kind of session, I think, usually. Shareholders in Australia are often quite reticent to be upfront, particularly retail ones, about problems. Institutional ones will be much more upfront, and we tend to deal with them through the AGM and the two proxy seasons I talked about. Retail shareholders will often be much more reticent to come forward, so they would expect, I guess, the board and the management team to sit in front of them on these information days, do a presentation on where we are with strategy and governance, and elicit questions from that. Sensible Australian companies don't just look at this as a couple of times a year thing. It's the regular fee. We get shareholders ringing us every day in the companies I'm involved with. So the investor relations manager in the main takes the brunt of that and makes a judgment on anything that needs to be referred to the chair or any chair of the board committee. So I guess for us it's a mix of things like shareholder information days, visits to sites like April was talking about, but it's the everyday stuff too. And the other thing that's growing up in Australia is, I don't know whether you've probably got similar things, but it's called hot copper in Australia. It's online gossip. This is another area that's, where the reality is going to drag the regulation with it. I mean, these people can say anything about the company. There's the whole conspiracy theory thing going on at times. And, you need to keep an eye on that kind of stuff too. And sometimes we will go back and correct misstatements. The Australian Stock Exchange is looking at this kind of thing too, and even querying. We have what we call speeding fines if share prices jump quickly, or the newspapers or the social media or whatever have put out their rumours, possibilities. We're now getting what we call speeding fines on this. Please explain. So it's another example of where there's a lot of stuff growing up that regulation really isn't up with yet. So we monitor that kind of thing too.
That's great. Thank you. Sorry.
Explain. I'm fascinated by this. This is Darla. Sorry. So you actually might have to pay a fine on something that a blogger says?
I call it a speed. It's a please explain. It's not.
Oh, okay. Okay.
It could conceivably, if it was bad enough, lead to a penalty. But speeding fine is just a general term to say you've been, I think, ticketed here. Please explain about this rumour or the newspapers put out. It often involves a deal that may be coming and something's leaked. But it's not just the traditional newspaper, TV. It's the shadowy
Bloggers.
Anybody can say whatever they want on the internet, and in a couple of relations with a couple of my companies, we've seen ridiculous stuff written. If it's ridiculous enough, we will correct. We will actually go. Our investor relations manager will go on and correct facts. We're not there to comment, and we've got to be very careful of continuous disclosure, which is the overriding regime. But you can't also let misstatements and really seriously incorrect things lie on the record either.
That's great. Thank you. Maybe, Chris, from the perspective of a proxy solicitor, what advice do you give companies and company secretaries about their year-round engagement? I mean, clearly it's a CSIA guideline in this practice. And
sure.
What do you do on the ground?
So most U.S. companies traditionally have done quarterly earnings calls with their portfolio manager investors and the actual people selecting the equity investments. But over the past maybe 5 to 10 years, a lot of U.S. public companies have spent more time focusing on the governance or proxy voting team at those same institutional investors. So that's now definitely moved towards a year-round engagement. And a lot of, not even just large companies, but now smaller companies do make a concerted effort to reach out to their investors during the summer, which, in the U.S., the proxy season is April, May, and June. So typically after the meetings, they'll reach out to their investors and say, okay, we heard you. Perhaps investors voted down a compensation arrangement or supported a certain shareholder proposal. So tell us what you really meant when you cast that vote. Were you voting against us because what aspect of the compensation didn't you like? Unfortunately, a U.S. say-on-pay vote is just a yes or no vote, but you really don't know what that means until you engage with the shareholder after the fact.
That's great. There's one question that's come in online that says every country has their own history and process in their own capital markets, including competitive behaviours and even company espionage. This is an interesting one. With online, and I think this is a key trust to it, with online facilities, every single shareholder, even if they only have one share, is capable of engaging in the meeting with critical questions. how do companies handle this? I'd like to pose this to Darla.
Okay. I raised my hand for this one. I only know a little bit about it, but in terms of the virtual annual meetings, there is the possibility that they can be disrupted by cyber hackers. And indeed, there are instances where this arose and was fixed before the annual meeting, but there was, it was touch and go for a while. So the question is a good one. It is clearly an issue. Boards and companies, I'm sure, all over the globe are spending a lot of time and money and thinking about this and talking about this and how to mitigate these risks. And it's no different for the annual meeting technology.
Perfect. Okay, well, I think that takes us to the end of our session 2. I think on behalf of the teacher, I'd just like to thank everyone on the panels for participating, and the 500 people around the world that joined us online. Thank you very much. I'd like to just pass to Kathy to say
Yes, Paul. Thank you, ComputerShare, and all of the panelists for the time that you devoted to be with us today and share your experiences on these really interesting cultural and global differences, but also the value of your experience in working with them. We appreciate your time. We appreciate your comments. And those of you who are participating, we very much appreciate your attendance and listening, and urge you to look at the materials that we've provided on the website, familiarize yourself with CSIA's new practices and principles, and we really look forward to hearing from you. Any comments you may have, we'll be engaging in a dialogue and with folks around the world on these principles in the year ahead, and we very much look forward to hearing from you. Thank you again for ComputerShare for hosting us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. A recording was taken during this conversation, and it will be available to all participants and registrants on Monday, April 20th. Thank you again for your time today.